At my sister's engagement party, Dad told her billionaire in-laws, Alisha drives a truck delivering meal kits. The room laughed at my cheap dress. Suddenly, the doors burst open. Armed federal agents swarmed in. The U.S. Secretary of State walked straight to me, ignoring my shocked family. Agent Cooper! My phone buzzed under the table twice before Dad even finished his sentence. I already knew what that meant. I let him have his laugh anyway. I let my sister's fiancé smirk into his champagne. I let my sister squeeze my arm under the tablecloth and whisper, just get through dinner, please. I grew up learning how to get through things. That was the family skill nobody ever gave me credit for. Our house sat at the end of a gravel road in a town small enough that the diner waitress remembered your order before you sat down, and large enough that everyone still had opinions about who you were supposed to become. My father ran the hardware store his own father had built, and he ran our house the same way. Inventory, expectations, a shelf for every person and every person on their shelf. My sister was the display model, polished, front and center, the one customers actually looked at. I was somewhere in the back stockroom, useful in theory, rarely checked on. She was 2 years younger and knew things I never learned, like how to laugh at a joke before the punchline landed, how to remember which uncle liked to be asked about his boat and which one liked to be asked about his grandkids, how to make an entire room feel like it had been waiting for her to walk in. My father called her his bright one. He called me difficult, though what he meant by difficult was usually just quiet, or focused on something he hadn't approved of first. When I was 12, I spent most of a summer building a scale replica of the county courthouse for a school history project. I used a hobby knife and basswood and a magnifying glass to get the window trim right, and I tested the roof joints by setting my father's toolbox on them one section at a time until I found the weak points and reinforced them. The night before the project was due, my sister needed somewhere to store her dance recital costumes because her closet was already full of dresses she'd worn twice. My father set the costume boxes on my desk without asking, directly on top of the courthouse, and one corner of the roof caved in under the weight. He looked at the broken model, then at me, like I was the one who'd made a mistake. You should have put it somewhere safer, he said. Not she should have asked. Not I shouldn't have set anything on top of a project you spent a month on. Somewhere safer, as if the problem was that I hadn't anticipated being erased. I rebuilt the corner overnight with tape and patience, and turned it in the next morning a little crooked, and it still placed second in the county fair. My sister's dance recital that weekend got a participation ribbon that my father hung on the refrigerator like a diploma. My second place certificate went into a drawer, and I don't think anyone in my family ever saw it again after that, including me. I found it years later folded inside an old binder. The ink faded at the crease where I'd rolled it to fit somewhere small enough not to be in anyone's way. My mother noticed things my father didn't, but she noticed them quietly, in a house where quiet was the only volume she had left. She packed my lunch with the crust cut off because she remembered I hated the crust and never once made me ask. She left the porch light burning on nights I stayed late at the library studying for tests nobody else in the house had bothered to ask me about. When my father dismissed something I'd worked hard on, she'd find a moment alone with me and press 2 fingers lightly against the inside of my wrist. It wasn't a hug. It wasn't even really a gesture anyone watching would have understood. It was just her way of saying, I see you, without saying anything my father could contradict. She wasn't a woman who fought loudly. I understood much later that loud hadn't been available to her for a long time, that she'd learned somewhere along the way to soften every sentence before it left her mouth so it wouldn't cost her anything at dinner. But when I sat her down at 17 and told her I wanted to enlist instead of doing the 2 years of community college my father had already decided on for me, she didn't ask if I was scared, and she didn't ask if I thought it through. She asked what time I needed to be at the recruiting office, and then she asked if I wanted eggs before we left. My father laughed into his coffee when I told him. The service, he said, like the word itself was a punchline. You hate being told what to do. I hate being told I can't do something, I said. That's different. He folded his newspaper the way he did when a conversation was over, whether or not he'd finished making his point, and looked over at my sister, who was filling out applications to schools with names that meant something at cocktail parties. Your sister has a plan, he said. You're running away from one. He wasn't entirely wrong, and it took me years to be able to admit that without it stinging. I was running, not away from responsibility. I'd never once in my life avoided work, but away from the version of myself that house kept building whether I wanted it or not. The one who walked into every room a half step behind everyone else, already apologizing for the space she was about to take up. My mother drove me to the recruiting station before sunrise on a morning cold enough that the fog sat low over the fields the whole way there. Neither of us said much. At the door, she reached into her coat and handed me a small envelope, sealed, my name written across the front in her handwriting, the letters leaning slightly to the right the way they always did when she wrote something she meant. Open it, she said. The day you stopped doubting yourself. I put it in the bottom of my duffel bag and didn't open it for 18 years. Basic training didn't make me fearless. It made fear something I could measure instead of something that measured me. Cold had a number attached to it. Distance had a number. Even failure, once you broke it down far enough, had a specific cause you could isolate and correct, which was more control than I'd ever had over anything in that house growing up. When my hands shook during my first live fire qualification, the instructor didn't call me difficult the way my father would have. He adjusted my stance, told me to breathe out after the shot instead of before it, and waited while I tried again until I got it right. I found out fast that I was good at something specific. Not the loudest person in a room, not the strongest, but the one who could stay still inside chaos long enough to see the one path everyone else had missed. It's a strange thing to discover about yourself in your late teens. In a training exercise with live rounds cracking somewhere close enough to feel in your chest that the skill your whole childhood had punished you for, staying quiet, watching instead of performing, working the problem instead of the room, was the exact skill that kept people alive. By my early 20s, I'd moved into intelligence support work, and by my late 20s into a track that eventually became protective operations, the kind of work where your title gets simpler the higher you go and your actual responsibilities get harder to explain at a dinner table. I coordinated movement routes for people whose faces showed up on the evening news. I planned contingencies for buildings most of my own extended family couldn't have found on a map. I learned to read a city block the way some people read a room, where the exits were, where the blind spots were, which direction a threat was most likely to come from if it came at all. None of that ever made it back home in any form my family could recognize, and a lot of that was by design. The work doesn't come with a business card you hand out at Thanksgiving, but some of it was also because nobody ever really asked. My sister filled in the blanks for people the way she filled in every blank, with whatever story made the room the most comfortable, whether or not it was true. The first time it happened, I almost corrected it. We were at a cousin's wedding and someone asked what I did for work, and before I could answer, my sister said I coordinated logistics for a private transportation company, which wasn't exactly a lie so much as it was the least interesting true thing she could have said. I opened my mouth to add more context and she caught my eye across the table with a look that meant not here, not now, and I let it go because it was a wedding and I didn't want to make it about me. The second time, at a work function of hers I'd been invited to as her +1, someone asked the same question, and she said I drove for a delivery service, something about specialty food boxes, and this time she didn't even glance at me first. It had already become the story. I remember standing there with a drink in my hand, watching her tell it so smoothly that I almost believed it myself for a second, like maybe somewhere along the way I actually had become the person she was describing. I let that one go too, and the one after that. Each time it got a little easier to let it go, and a little harder to imagine correcting it without turning a simple work question into a scene nobody wanted at a party. I told myself it didn't matter what strangers thought I did for a living. I told myself the work spoke for itself in the rooms that actually needed to know, and those rooms didn't include my sister's engagement circuit. What I didn't account for was how much it would cost me at home, specifically over years, to let a story calcify that far. By the time I made agent, the actual title, the one that meant something specific and had taken most of a decade to earn, my father had already built an entire identity for me out of half-heard details and his own assumptions, and there was no longer a clean way to correct it without it sounding like I'd been lying to him the whole time, which felt, some nights, uncomfortably close to true. My mother was the only one who ever asked real questions, quietly, usually over the phone late at night when my father was already asleep. She never asked me to explain the parts I couldn't explain. She just asked if I was safe and if I was eating, and once, memorably, whether the people I worked with knew how good I was at my job, because she wanted to make sure somebody did. They know, I told her. Good, she said. That's all I needed to hear. She died while I was overseas on an assignment I couldn't leave early enough to explain, and by the time emergency travel orders cleared and I made it back home, the flowers at her funeral had already started to brown at the edges. My father met me on the porch before I'd even made it up the front steps. You always choose the job, he said. I didn't argue with him, because there was no version of that conversation that would have gone anywhere, and because some part of me was too tired from 30 hours of transit and too raw from the loss itself to spend what was left of me defending a choice he'd never once tried to understand. My sister told me later that our mother had been too sedated in her final hours to ask for anyone specifically. I never fully believed that, and I never fully let myself disbelieve it either. I carried that particular uncertainty into more hotel rooms and more early mornings than I can count. The sealed envelope stayed at the bottom of a metal case in my closet for years after that, unopened, because I hadn't yet reached the day she'd described, the day I stopped doubting myself. And some nights I wondered if that day was ever going to come, or if I was going to spend my whole career being good at something nobody at home would ever believe I actually did. My sister met her fiancé at a charity gala 2 years ago, the kind of event where the tickets alone cost more than most people's monthly rent, and everyone there already assumes everyone else belongs. His family had money that went back generations, the kind that doesn't advertise itself because it's never had to. His father had built a fortune in commercial real estate and advised people whose names appeared in headlines. His mother sat on boards. He himself worked in something vague and well compensated that my sister described, when she described it at all, as finance, the same way she'd once described my entire career as delivery. She called me the week they got engaged, breathless, and I was happy for her in a real way that had nothing to do with the money, because whatever else was true between us, I did love my sister, and I could hear in her voice that she'd found someone who made her feel the way she'd always tried to make other people feel about her, chosen specifically on purpose. You'll come to the engagement party, right? She said. It's going to be small. Family, close friends, his parents' place. Of course, I said. Good. A pause. The kind she used before saying something she'd already decided how to phrase. You still have that navy dress from my aunt's funeral? I have a black suit too, I said. I could wear that instead. The suits make you look severe, she said. The navy dress is better. It reads humble. I didn't ask her what exactly she meant by reads because I already knew, and some tired, familiar part of me had stopped expecting the conversation to go any other way. She told me not to park anywhere visible near the house. His parents' neighborhood had an association with opinions about visiting vehicles, she said, and my truck, government-issued, unremarkable on purpose, might get mistaken for a contractor's if I left it out front. She suggested I park a few streets over and walk in. And if anyone asks what you do, she said, just say logistics. Keep it simple. His dad's advised 2 administrations. ones. These people aren't going to understand the specifics of gig work, and I don't want you getting cornered explaining app-based delivery scheduling to someone who thinks Uber is a personality flaw. I let a breath out slowly before I answered, mostly so she wouldn't hear it. I'll keep it brief, I said. Perfect, just blend in. It's one night. After the call, I sat at my kitchen island with a weapon disassembly mat in front of me, half my sidearm broken down into its component pieces, slide, spring, barrel, laid out in the exact order they always went, because there was something steadying about doing one thing perfectly, while everything else in my life stayed slightly out of focus. I thought about correcting her. I thought about it seriously, for maybe the length of time it took to seat the recoil spring back into the slide. Then I thought about the look she'd give me if I did it at her engagement party specifically, of all the nights available, and I let it go, the same way I'd let it go for years, because it had never once seemed like the right night to finally make it about me. The morning of the party, I had a scheduled convoy movement that ran longer than expected, a foreign witness transfer at a regional airport, freezing rain sideways across the tarmac the entire time, 2 security posture changes before we got the package into federal custody without incident. My supervising officer, a man who'd worked with me on and off for over a decade, met the convoy at the hangar afterward. Still finding the exit nobody else sees, he said, which was as close as he ever came to a compliment, and coming from him it meant more than most people's paragraphs. My phone buzzed on the drive home. A message from my father, no greeting, just a request that I stop at the wholesale store on my way to my sister's place because my truck had room for the drink cases her caterer had run short on. No question about where I'd been all morning. No question about whether I was tired, whether the transfer had gone smoothly, whether anything about my day had been difficult, just the cases, and the assumption that my truck's cargo space was the most useful thing about me. I bought the drinks. At my sister's building, she opened the door in a robe with her nail polish still drying, glanced at the cases in my arms and said, "Careful, don't drag them, the floors are new," before disappearing back down the hallway to finish getting ready. My boots had crossed unmarked roads and secure compounds and floors I couldn't describe to her if she'd asked, which she didn't. In her apartment, they were only ever dirty. That evening, I put on the navy dress in an unfamiliar guest bathroom at his parents' estate, the fabric a little looser than it had been at the funeral 2 years earlier, and looked at myself in a mirror, gilded enough that it probably cost more than my truck. I didn't look like someone who'd spent that morning walking a foreign witness through 2 security posture changes in freezing rain. I looked exactly like what my sister had asked me to look like, humble, blended in. I walked out to join the party, and for the first hour, that's precisely what I did. The house smelled like white roses and old money in a way that's hard to describe unless you've stood in it. Not perfume exactly, more like the absence of anything cheap. A silence in the air where the smell of a normal party might otherwise be. A string trio played somewhere near the staircase. Waitstaff moved through the room with trays balanced at shoulder height, offering things I didn't recognize by name and didn't ask about. The women wore soft, expensive colors and diamonds small enough to be tasteful, which I would later understand is its own kind of flex. The confidence that nobody in the room needs convincing you can afford bigger ones. My sister found me near the entrance and looped her arm through mine before I'd made it 3 steps inside. "You look nice," she said in a tone that suggested she was reassuring herself more than me. "Just try not to be strange tonight, okay?" "I'll do my best," I said. She led me toward a small cluster near the fireplace, her fiancé's parents at the center of it, flanked by people whose names I forgot as soon as I heard them because none of them seemed interested in remembering mine either. His father had the specific posture of a man who'd spent decades in rooms where he was the reason everyone else stood a little straighter. His mother's eyes moved over me methodically, from my hair, unstyled because I hadn't had time between the airport and the party, down to the scuffed heel of my one good pair of shoes, the same pair I'd been meaning to replace for over a year and never had the occasion to. "So you're the sister," his mother said, in the tone people use when they've already decided what that means. "We've heard you travel quite a bit." "I do," I said. "Deliveries, is it?" his father said, swirling wine he probably hadn't paid full retail for in years. "Some kind of specialty food service?" "Secure logistics," my sister said quickly, before I could answer, with a small laugh meant to smooth the whole exchange over before it could become one. "She means packages, mostly. She likes the open road, no office, no real structure to it." "Not everyone is suited to structure," his mother said, and smiled at me the way you'd smile at a child who'd tried very hard at something you didn't think was worth the effort. My father joined the circle a moment later, wine in hand, and for exactly 1 second, I let myself believe he might say something different. He didn't. "We tried, believe me," he said, shaking his head like the memory itself was tiring. "Community college, bookkeeping, even a stint at the bank. She's always preferred the harder road for no reason anyone's ever been able to explain to me." A few of my sister's friends drifted into the circle over the next several minutes, drawn the way people are drawn to any story with a punchline they can add to. One asked with real curiosity whether delivery drivers kept the food if customers didn't answer the door. Another wondered aloud whether companies like that offered dental. My father laughed at both questions harder than either of them deserved, the kind of laugh that told the room he was in on something, that he understood exactly who I was and found it more amusing than anything else. Her fiancé's father put a heavy hand on my shoulder at one point, the gesture of a man used to delivering feedback he considered generous. "Society needs people like you," he said, "the hands and feet of things. Not everyone can lead. There's a kind of wisdom in knowing your place." I felt the weight of his hand through the cheap fabric of my dress and thought, briefly and clearly, of a courthouse model with a caved-in roof, of a second-place certificate folded small enough to fit in the back of a drawer, of 2 fingers pressed lightly against the inside of my wrist on a night my mother hadn't said a single word out out loud. I said nothing. I'd had a lot of practice saying nothing in rooms exactly like this one. If you've ever stood in a room and listened to your own family describe your life to strangers as if it were something they'd learned generously to tolerate, you already understand why silence in that moment can cost more than shouting ever would. It isn't that you don't have the words. It's that you've learned over years that the words never land the way you need them to. Not in that room, not with those people, not on that particular night. I checked the time without meaning to. 9:40. My sister's fiancé cleared his throat somewhere near the head of the room, tapping a spoon against his glass, and I understood the toasts were about to start, which meant at least another 20 minutes of standing exactly where I was, holding exactly this expression, saying exactly nothing. My phone buzzed once against my hip. I assumed for a second that it was a work notification I could ignore until the party wound down. I was wrong about that, though I didn't know it yet. The toast went the way toasts at parties like that always go. His best man told a story about a fishing trip that made everyone laugh a beat before the actual joke arrived. His mother said something gracious about family and legacy that managed to mention 3 separate wineries the family owned, and my sister cried the kind of tears that photograph well. My father waited until the room had settled into its second round of champagne before standing to say a few words of his own, and I felt my stomach drop slightly, the way it always did right before he decided to be charming at my expense. I want to say something about my daughters, he began, raising his glass toward my sister first, a long, warm paragraph about her drive, her warmth, how she'd always known exactly who she wanted to become and gone after it without apology. The room nodded along. Someone near the back said softly to her, and everyone laughed the easy laugh of people who agreed completely. Then his eyes found me, and I watched him decide, in real time, to make me the punchline instead of the point. And my other daughter, he said, gesturing loosely in my direction with his glass, already smiling like he knew the room was about to enjoy this. Well, she's here too. She drives a truck delivering meal kits, if you can believe that. We tried everything to steer her towards something more stable. She's always preferred the harder road. The room laughed, not unkindly exactly, the specific, comfortable laugh of people who'd been handed a story that asked nothing further of them, a shape they could slot me into without having to look any closer. Her fiancé's father chuckled into his wine. Somebody's cousin whispered something to somebody else's wife. I felt every set of eyes in that room take one look at my faded navy dress and my one good pair of scuffed shoes and conclude that the story fit. I looked down at the dress. I thought about the fact that I'd been standing in a hangar with freezing rain on my shoulders 12 hours earlier, coordinating a security posture change for a foreign witness whose name I couldn't have told anyone in that room even if I'd wanted to. I thought about how easy it would be, in this exact moment, to correct him, and how completely it would ruin the party if I did, and how some tired, worn-down part of me had decided years ago that ruining the party was never worth what it cost afterward. My phone buzzed a second time against my hip, and this one I recognized instantly, the way you recognize your own name called out in a crowd. Not a notification, not a reminder. A specific pattern of vibration my unit used for exactly one purpose, reserved for exactly one kind of message. 60 seconds. Secure the room. I felt something in my chest shift gears the way it always did in the field, the noise of the party receding slightly, my attention narrowing down to the specific clean shape of a job that needed doing. Excuse me, I said, setting my glass down on the nearest tray. I need to step out for a moment. Nobody in the circle looked up except my sister, who caught something in my expression she couldn't quite place and chose, the way she'd chosen all evening, not to ask about it. I walked toward the hallway that led to the guest bathroom, and then past it, out through the side door that led onto the driveway, past the row of valet-parked luxury cars glinting under the porch lights, toward the one vehicle at that party nobody had looked at twice all night. Black, unremarkable on purpose, dark windows, government plates half covered under a magnetic panel I'd installed myself years ago for exactly this kind of situation. My truck, the one my father had just told an entire room of strangers hauled meal kit boxes up and down the interstate for a living. I climbed in, closed the door, and reached under the passenger seat for the case that lived there permanently. Wherever I went, whatever I was wearing. The case held what it always held. A tactical vest folded into a shape that took up almost no space. A radio, a spare magazine, my actual credentials in a slim leather fold that had never once, in 3 years, made an appearance at a single family function. I pulled the vest on over the navy dress, the fabric bunching slightly at the waist where it wasn't designed to sit over anything but standard field gear, and clipped the radio to the strap at my shoulder. My hands didn't shake. They hadn't shaken in years, not for this kind of call. And there was something almost peaceful in that stillness, a kind of clarity that never once showed up anywhere in my family's version of who I was. In their story, I was the daughter who couldn't hold down something respectable. In this one, in the only version that had ever actually been true, I was the person a room went quiet for when things went wrong. The radio crackled. You copy? Copy, I said. I'm 2 minutes out. Status? Primary transport took damage. Routes compromised. We need the nearest hardened location with controlled access, and command flagged your position as closest by a wide margin. I looked back at the house through the windshield, lit up gold behind its iron gate, string trio still faintly audible even through closed windows, my entire family standing somewhere inside it under the impression that I'd stepped out to use the bathroom. There was something almost funny about it, in the specific, exhausted way things become funny only after they've stopped being able to hurt you as much as they used to. Copy that, I said. I've got a location, converging now. I put the truck in gear and drove back through the gate I'd just walked out of on foot 20 minutes earlier, the tires crunching gravel loud enough that a valet straightened up fast, hand halfway to his radio before he recognized the vehicle and stood back instead. Some instinct in him understanding this wasn't a car that needed directing. I parked directly across the front steps, engine still running, and reached for the door handle. Behind me, through the rear window, I could just make out the shape of the convoy assembling at the end of the street, headlights cutting through the dark in a pattern I recognized without needing to count the vehicles, because I'd built that exact pattern myself more times than I could remember. Whatever this house thought I was, in about 90 seconds, they were going to find out otherwise, and there was no version of tonight left where I got to control how that landed. The doors went first, heavy double oak, the kind installed specifically to look like they'd never move without effort, slamming back against the interior walls hard enough that I heard, even from the driveway, the specific high ring of the crystal chandelier shuddering above the entryway. 4 agents moved through the opening in a formation I'd drilled with people on more mornings than I could count, vests dark against the pale marble floor, fanning out fast and low into a room that had, 90 seconds earlier, been full of nothing more dangerous than gossip. I came in directly behind them, and the sound that met me was the particular total silence of 200 conversations stopping at once. My father's wine glass hit the floor somewhere near the fireplace before he'd even fully turned to see what was happening, the crystal shattering into a spray that nobody in the room seemed to register. Every head already turned toward the doorway instead. Her fiancé's father stood frozen near the center of the room, phone half raised in his hand like he'd been in the process of deciding whether to call someone before his brain caught up with what he was looking at. His wife's face had gone the exact color of the tablecloth behind her. My sister stood near the head table in her silver dress, one hand still resting on her fiancé's arm, staring at the vest strapped over my navy dress like I'd shown up in a costume nobody had told her about. "Enough," my father said, finding his voice first, stepping forward with his phone raised like a weapon of his own. "Whatever this is, you need to leave, now, before I call the police myself." "I don't care what fantasy you're acting out," her fiancé's father said, recovering enough to remember whose house this was. "You are on private property. Put whatever that is down immediately." I didn't answer either of them yet. I touched the radio at my shoulder instead, listening to a countdown running somewhere on the other end of the line, watching the front door over both their shoulders the way you watch a door you already know is about to open on something that's going to change the shape of the room permanently. 30 seconds, I said, mostly to myself, mostly into the radio. My sister let out something between a laugh and a gasp, the specific sound of someone trying to convince themselves what they were seeing wasn't real. Somewhere behind me, a heavy vehicle door closed on the street outside. Footsteps crossed the stone porch, unhurried, the particular even pace of someone whose security detail had already cleared every step of ground ahead of him. The front door opened fully behind the 4 agents already in the room, and every remaining conversation in that house finally, completely stopped. The man my family had watched on television more times than any of us could count walked through that doorway flanked by 2 more agents, overcoat still damp from the rain outside, a secure case held against his chest with the specific grip of someone who'd been briefed on exactly how much that case mattered. His eyes found me instantly across a room full of people he'd never met and had no reason to look at twice, and he crossed the marble floor toward me without acknowledging a single other person in the house. "Agent Cooper," he said, "the primary transport's compromised. We move now." The room didn't just go quiet. It went somewhere past quiet, into the specific, airless silence of 200 people simultaneously trying and failing to reconcile what they were looking at with what they'd been told an hour earlier over a toast. Her fiancé's father's phone slipped out of his hand entirely and hit the rug without him seeming to notice it was gone. My sister's mouth opened and nothing came out of it. My father stared at me the way you'd stare at a stranger wearing your daughter's face. I didn't look at either of them yet. I turned to the secretary instead. "Professional. Already moving. Copy. I've got the room secured. We'll go out through the kitchen. Fewer sightlines to the street. I trust your route," he said. And something in the plainness of that sentence landed somewhere in me that 3 years of family dinners had never once reached. I turned back toward the hallway, and my father stepped directly into my path, hand closing around my wrist the way it had 100 times growing up. The grip that always meant, "Sit down. Don't embarrass me. Not here. Except here, tonight." Embarrassed wasn't remotely the word for what was happening on his face. "What is this?" he said, his voice cracking somewhere in the middle of the sentence. "Not now, Dad," I said. "I've got a principle to move." I watched something behind his eyes try, visibly, to rearrange every version of me he built over the last 30 years around the 2 words he'd just heard a cabinet secretary use to address his daughter, and failed to do it fast enough to catch up before I'd already moved past him. Her fiancé's father found his voice again somewhere behind me, thinner now than it had been all night. "We had no idea," he said, to no one in particular, to everyone in the room at once. She never said anything. "Professionals with her clearance don't explain themselves at cocktail parties," the secretary said, already moving toward the kitchen entrance I'd indicated, not slowing down for the observation, not needing to. My sister's voice finally found its way out of her, small and shaking. "Colonel?" she said, though nobody had used that word yet, though somewhere in the last 30 seconds, she'd apparently put together more of the actual shape of my life than my father had managed in 3 full years of dinners. I didn't answer her either. There wasn't time, and there wasn't, in that particular moment, anything left to say that would have mattered more than getting a sitting cabinet secretary out of a compromised location as fast and as cleanly as I possibly could. I moved through the kitchen ahead of the detail, past a caterer frozen mid-motion with a tray of champagne flutes still balanced on one arm, out the service entrance into the cold. The rain had led up to a fine mist that caught the porch lights in a way that would have looked almost pretty if I'd had a second to notice it. Behind me, through the open door, I could still hear the room I'd just left. Not silence anymore, but the specific, scattered noise of 200 people all trying to talk about what they'd just seen at the same time, none of them landing on anything coherent. The secretary moved into the second vehicle without another word. Already back inside whatever version of his evening, this was just one stop within. I closed the door behind him myself and gave the driver a single nod through the window. The convoy pulled away from the curb in the exact formation I'd built for it, and within seconds, the house behind me was just lights and noise again, smaller in the mirror with every second that passed. I stood on the wet gravel in a navy dress and a tactical vest that didn't match anything about the evening it had started, and for the first time all night, nobody was watching me at all. I didn't go back inside. There wasn't anything left in that house for me to say that hadn't already been said better 30 seconds earlier, by 2 words a man on television had used without a second thought, the same 2 words my own father had spent 3 years failing to imagine belonged to me.